Welcome to Broad Eye, the podcast that explores knowledge gaps in ophthalmology and eye care. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Broad Eye podcast. My name is Sean Maloney, and today I am going to be speaking with Dr. Mahadeo Sukhai. Dr. Sukhai is the Director of Research Accessibility Officer at the CNIB. He's also an assistant professor at Queen's University, which is actually where I went to school, and he wouldn't have known that before we were saying this right now, and holds a number of other titles. So Dr. Sukhai, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Sean. Pleasure to be here.
Thanks for joining. So I alluded to this in our little discussion before we started recording, and it's I usually send guests questions ahead of time just as guideposts, but this is something I wanted to bring up because you have already impacted my life and you don't even realize it. And there's a little blurb in your email signature that I don't remember a word for it in front of me, but it was something to the tune of I aspire to and respect a work-life balance. So I don't expect, a reply to this, in some outside of working hours. Can you just comment on that, why that's in your email signature, and or if maybe the origins of that?
I appropriated it actually from a colleague of mine at the University of Saskatchewan College of Medicine. They had it in their email signature, and it struck me as something that was very, very important to keep in mind. And I actually started to put that in my signature pre-pandemic, and it turned out to be absolutely prescient. I started to include this in my SIG as of December of 2019, and I put it in because I thought that it was necessary to just say to people, you know what, there's so many emails that come in from multiple time zones across the world sometimes, and some of us work 9 to 5, some of us work 8 to 4, some of us work 7 to 3, some of us work 10 to 6. I tend to flex my day a little bit more than that. And so there will be a time where I'm in front of my computer to deal with emails or on my phone to deal with emails, but I wanted people to appreciate and respect that there's boundaries, right? We don't have to reply to an email instantly. And this message, when I saw it in my colleagues emails, I said to them, after I digested it for a day or so, do you mind if I appropriate that? And they said, no, absolutely, feel free, because I hope it goes viral. And so I started to use it, and it is going viral. I've had people say to me, much the same as you just did, Sean, it's a resonant note, and some have stolen it without asking permission, which is totally fine. That's what going viral means. And some of us have asked permission, and I've said it's not really mine to give permission of. I did get permission to use it from the person I took it from, but I'm going to pay it forward, and feel free.
No, it's very cool. And what I found unique about that, I mean, we've heard before, well, you need, work-life balance, but it was the respect part, because I mean, we all in some ways, or at least tell ourselves that we aspire to a work-life balance, but it was more the, I respect a work-life balance too. I'm thinking, I never really thought of that. Like, sometimes at nighttime, kids are in bed, and my wife is going for a workout or doing whatever, and I'm like, I'll just sit down and crank out some emails at 10 o'clock at night, and never thought about just the other end of that, thinking like, oh, hey, if people wondering why is he sitting at 10 o'clock at night, why is he just writing me at 9 in the morning? So,
but you don't have to hit send on the email so that it goes out at 10 o'clock at night. And I mean, it depends on which email client you have. So CNIB is an Office 365 environment, and one of the interesting things about Outlook is it allows you to delay send your email. And so I'll do the same thing that you'll do. I'll sit down and I'll reply to emails. It's 10:30 at night, because it's great to kind of get them out of the way and deal with them. Or you wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning and you do it. And sometimes you just don't want to wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning. And so if it's easier to sit down at 10:30 at night and deal with the emails, then you do that, and then you hit you hit send, but it's a delayed send. So I do this, and I do this with emails on the weekend as well. I will hit send so that the emails will go out first thing business hours the next business day. So if I'm sending emails on a Saturday, they go out Monday morning at 8 a.m. If I send emails on a Monday night, they go out Tuesday morning at 8 a.m.
So there's a program that I don't know if it still exists, called Boomerang for Gmail, which is the same concept where you could schedule your emails to send at certain times. So I did that in the past to make it look like I was working really early, really early. So the night before, at 7, 8 o'clock, I write these emails and have them go out at, like 5:46 in the morning, make it look like I was working really early. But in fact, I was in bed. But anyhow, that's a different story. So you have the title, many titles. One is the first congenitally blind biomedical researcher, I think, in the world, at least that my sources know of. You hold a PhD in cancer genetics from the University of Toronto. I was hoping first you could comment a little bit on the cause of your congenital blindness.
I was born with cataracts.
Really?
Yes.
I didn't know that. I did not know that.
I'm not sure you can Google that part of my background.
No, it just says that first congenitally blind.
No. So I was born with cataracts. I also wasn't born here. I was born in the Caribbean. And the thing is that lots of kids are born with cataracts, rather more so than you might think. I mean, it is pretty rare, but at the end of the day, there's millions of kids born each day, and so some proportion of that number is always going to be born with cataracts. So, but I was born with cataracts, and I was born at a period of time where, and in a part of the world where, sort of the perinatal diagnosis of cataracts or retinoblastoma, both of which require shining the flashlight into the eye, they weren't done. Not in that space, not in that time. And so my diagnosis wasn't actually picked up until I was 10 months old, by which point, of course, the neural pathways around focus and tracking and things like this are already laid down in your visual cortex, and you can't undo that. And so when my lenses were finally removed, there was a neural residue, if you will, left behind, such that although I can see, I can't track, I can't focus, and there's a few other things that I can't do. And at the end of the day, I am legally blind, and that's with my glasses on. Without my glasses on, you can't actually measure what I can or can't see, because I can't do the eye chart. I can't do the Snellen chart. So that's the way it's been for how many ever years, right? Because you Googled me, you could probably figure out when I was born. But it's interesting because people are sort of like, well, you had cataracts, why didn't you just get implants? And implants weren't necessarily a choice at that point in time. And they certainly were not a choice in the country I was born in. And I had cataract surgery done in the United Kingdom, and the pediatric ophthalmologist actually gave my parents a choice and they said, you can give him implants, or you can do laser surgery. The problem is that the success of these techniques in children at this point in time is very low, and so you could do it, but odds are you'd have to continually go in and do additional things. And so is that something that you want for your kid? And they said no. In retrospect, I realized that was actually a very good decision that they made. Better to go with the option of sort of safety and conservatism, given that we didn't live in the UK, we lived in the Caribbean. And so having to either go back and forth or have more advanced routine care in a different part of the world than you're supposed to live in is problematic at best. So that ended up leading to the sort of suite of associated visual conditions to my congenital cataract.
Okay, so tell me the story, please, from
which story?
Well, there's so many, I know. That from the journey, from that 10-month-old who went to the UK to the 20-something that finished with a PhD at in cancer genetics. Just along the way, were there any major challenges, which I'm assuming there were?
Lots of entertaining stuff,
yeah,
yes.
Shoot,
and the thing is, I say entertaining because
yeah.
you can retrospectively think on these things and turn them into jokes and turn them into stories. And the problem is that life is not that linear, right?
No, of course.
And
yeah.
the joke appears afterward. It doesn't appear as you're living it.
That's true.
And so although we might all live a joke, none of us realize this until after the fact. I was born in Guyana, which is on the continent of South America, for those who don't know, but it's culturally part of the Caribbean, and grew up on the islands of Jamaica and Barbados before my family emigrated to Canada when I was 10 and 3/4, almost 11. And the thing is that when I was diagnosed, we were in Guyana, and the ophthalmologists in Guyana were the ones who diagnosed me, and one of them offered a treatment protocol where he said he would take multiple surgeries to go in and cut out slivers of the lens and pull them out one at a time. And by the time that's done, there would be so much scarring and the surface of the eyeball would be destroyed. I'd be totally blind no matter what. That was a legitimate ophthalmologist choice in 1979, apparently. There was another ophthalmologist who turned around and said, well, you know, he's blind, we can't do anything, so just consign him to an institution, or you know, basically have him be a street corner seller in Guyana, kind of thing. Neither of those options my parents took seriously, and so they went hunting for other options. And I mean, you think about it, right? You're in a developing country, you know, in a country where at that point in time inflation was ultimately going to end up with one Guyanese dollar equal to 200 US dollars, or about 150 Canadian, and that's today. And 50 years ago, in the early part of the 1970s, it was like one Guyanese to maybe 2 or 3 US. And then inflation took off, and the country lived with a socialist dictatorship until 1992. And so inflation kind of went into the pits the whole time. And so money was losing currency left and right. Like money was getting devalued left and right. And my parents made this choice to expend a massive amount of resources to go get an opinion from outside, an international opinion, an opinion in the United Kingdom. And so we had family in the UK, and they were able to help with some of that, but that's still a massive amount of time, massive amount of money, massive amount of logistical expense, right? Not to mention the fracturing of the family, because, you know, my mother went with me and left the other kids with my dad. And so there was a sundering for months on end. And so my surgeries happened when I was about 16 or 17 months old. And then, you know, ultimately, after staying in the UK for 6 or 8 months or something like that, we came back to Guyana. But now you've got a toddler who's never seen before in his life, right? Except for light sensation and light and shadow. And then this toddler is starting to grow up and figuring out how to go to school and all sorts of things like that. And so when we emigrated, we were emigrating in search of better education for all of us, but particularly better education and better pediatric ophthalmology for me. And, you know, we stayed in Jamaica for a few months. We went to Barbados. When we were in Barbados, the public school system basically was of the opinion that they didn't want a blind kid in school. That wasn't the thing. And so I had to be homeschooled until we could find a private school, and then another private school. And so at no point in time did I actually have the kind of education that one would consider to be sort of public education, sort of the education that every child would be expected to be exposed to between the ages of 4 and 14. Never had it, don't know what it looks like, don't know what it feels like, never experienced it. And in not experiencing it, it actually meant I was jumped ahead. So by the time we emigrated from Barbados to Toronto in Ontario, Canada, I was 10 and due to go into the Barbadian equivalent of grade 9, what was called Form 3 in the British school system. And coming here, you might imagine that one doesn't put a 10-year-old in grade 9. And in fact, what I found out was because I didn't have any French facility, not growing up with French on the island of Barbados, they actually hold you back by a year. At least they would have in the Toronto District School Board of that generation. And so I was supposed to go into grade 4, which I thought was unconscionable because I didn't particularly want to learn how to do multiplication in grade 4 because I'd already learned that like 6 years before.
That's a wild difference.
so I felt I would have been bored out of my mind. And I pointed this out to my parents and they said, yes, but these are the rules of this new country that we live in. And I more or less said, screw the rules. And if I don't get into grade 9, I'm going back to Barbados by myself. And that actually is a true story. I did actually say that. That's not a joke. And so there was some pushing and shoving, which is how I would characterize it, and I ended up in grade 9 at the age of 10. And so these were the days of OAC, and I didn't think to push the system further and try to do high school in 4 or even 3 years. So I finished OAC when I was 15 and entered university when I was 15. And I'm going to loop back a bit and say to you that from the age of 4, I've always wanted to be a scientist. And at first, I actually wanted to be an astronomer. And what really did it was a Chelsea Bonstall painting in 1944 or 1945 of what we thought the surface of Saturn's largest moon, Titan, looked like at that point in time, before we knew it had a much thicker atmosphere or much denser atmosphere than we thought it did then. And it was such a beautiful painting, so high contrast, so vivid. And you know, my perspective is, if that is science, I want to do that for the rest of my life. And I was voracious. Any science, all science, I ate it up, right? And so, although astronomy was my first love, it was by no means my only point of focus in the sciences. And so, you know, in going into high school and going into grade 9, I kept that love of sciences going. And it was one of those things where, because my grades were what they were, nobody could really say, well, you can't do science because you're blind. Nobody said that in Barbados to me. Nobody said that in Guyana to me. But to be fair, nobody also said I could do science, right? And so people will say to me, well, you never had any itinerant teachers. You never had any educational assistants. You know, how did you get by? And the funny thing about authority, Sean, is authority is both a positive and a negative. Authority can show you a path, but authority can also block you from paths if they don't think you can do something. And I never had anybody, including my parents, who said, you can't do this thing that you want to do. And so it never entered into my consciousness until I actually met people here on Canadian soil, who were sort of like, are you sure you want to do this? Did it even occur to me that it was possible to not do the thing that was in my head? Right? Because I'd wanted to do it since I was 4, and nobody had said, no, you can't. I think my parents were humoring me. I don't think they knew how far I could go. I don't think they knew how to get me there. But they never said, no, we can't do that. They didn't helicopter that way. Right? I mean, this is the same set of parents who said, okay, we're going to teach you how to ride a bike, get on a bike without training wheels and go ride the bike. And if you fall down, you fall down, too bad. That's, by the way, not the greatest way to learn how to ride a bike. I didn't ever learn how to ride a bike because I didn't like falling down and bruising my knees that way. And so that mentality carried over to education. It's like, you're going to get an education. Education's important. You're going to do an education. You're going to learn stuff. And if at the end of all the learning of this stuff, science is what you want to do, and we can figure out how the heck to get you to do it, then okay, fine. But there was nobody there to say, this is how you do it. There was also nobody there to say, this is not something you should do. And one of the really interesting things that I learned after I started to take an interest in the accessibility of science education is that lots of people actually tell students with disabilities, you can't do that. And lots of people will tell students with disabilities, well, you can't do, or students with vision loss, sorry, you can't do science, you know, do Braille instead, or you can't do science, do, you know, some other, I'm going to use the term that was used in university with me, and it's going to come across as a little bit pejorative, basket weaving instead, right? But nobody ever said that to me, because I was never in any of those situations where any of that was possible. When I got into grade 9 and my parents were asked, well, what kind of special education do you want for your son? Their answer was, special education. What are you talking about? We've never had special education. He's never needed special education. Why would you give him a special education? And again, it comes down to, if you don't have something and you don't know its benefits, you also don't have something and don't know its curse. And so I never had the opportunity to interact with a system that is actually set up to benefit students with all kinds of learning needs. And it's a great system, but it's just not a system that I interacted with. I interacted with special ed because they had to give me my large print exams, right? These were the days where you'd blow up exams on a photocopier, right? You wouldn't bother printing things out large using a dot matrix printer or anything like that. You'd blow up things on a photocopier and they'd be blown up like 150% or whatever. So I'd get my large print exams. I'd get my extra time, not that I ever used it, but I'd have it, and that was all. I didn't need an EA. I didn't want an EA. I didn't consider an EA. And I didn't have my classes in a special ed kind of room. And I know many other people who have had that experience and it's been beneficial to them. But by not having the experience growing up, what ends up happening is your attitudes toward all of this get formed at a young age, and they get informed by your parents' attitudes toward things. And so if you don't have access to supports, it's like you feel like you don't want them or you don't need them, because they would have been really beneficial when you were younger, but you didn't have them. So it's sort of like, well, screw them now, right? Kind of thing. You don't want them because you don't really see the point. So when I started my undergrad, I was 15, and I started in astronomy because that still was my first love. Then I met a computer science instructor who frankly couldn't teach computer science. And then something happened that in retrospect, I kind of sort of regret, but kind of sort of don't. I regret letting somebody who couldn't teach dictate my choice of what to study. So it wasn't that I couldn't do computer science, because you need computer science and coding to do physics and astronomy. It wasn't that I couldn't do it. It's that I absolutely loathed the learning environment that I was in. And so I chose to get out of that learning environment. And in retrospect, that was an interesting choice to make, because I went from astronomy to molecular biology. I went from the study of the very big to the study of the very small, and I got far away from computer science, which is ironic, because at the end of the day, I ended up in cancer genomics and personalized medicine and bioinformatics, and I mean, I had to learn how to code. So this is actually why I regret not learning how to code when I was 15, when it would have been a lot easier to learn how to code. But I made a choice based on the information available to me at the time. So I went into molecular biology, and because I had had no prior exposure to molecular biology, everyone was sort of like, "What the hell are you doing here?" And so then it became a much more interesting sort of road through, because there was all sorts of expectations of failure, and I won't speak to what was in my professors' minds. I'm certain some of them appreciated the opportunity to teach me. I'm certain some of them may not have. And I'm certain some of them may have wondered what was actually going on. But I got to the end of my undergrad, and I got to the end of my undergrad, got into a master's program. It took me 6 or 7 tries to get into a master's program. That's how many applications before I actually got let in. And then I was able to gain research experience. And one of the things that I realized doing research first for my master's and then for my PhD was that I was really, really, really good at it. And I really enjoyed it. That the puzzle of figuring out how to falsify a hypothesis, the puzzle of designing a hypothesis, designing a study around what to do with that hypothesis and how to test it, all of that was something that I genuinely appreciated, and I got very good at it, and so bachelor's begat master's, master's begat PhD. I went from molecular bio to molecular pharmacology, from molecular pharmacology to cancer genetics, from cancer genetics to cancer genomics, then to experimental therapeutics, and then back to cancer genomics again, before I left academic medicine in 2017 to come and do what's basically population data sciences and epidemiology and public health research in this phase of my career. And so was that easy? No. Was that a circular route or a very winding route? Absolutely it was. Did I actually get the career that I thought that I was going to get at the end of it? Nope, I did not. But it was a journey worth pursuing, no matter how many people thought privately or otherwise that it wasn't, or that I shouldn't have. So not at all an easy road. It sounds very linear. I assure you it was not in the doing of it. And it was also one of those things where during that road, I learned, much like you learned from doing the searches, that I actually was the first person who was born blind to actually do something like this. Because there were lots of people who were born blind who never made it in to the sciences at the university level. And I got really interested in understanding why that was. And I got really interested once I started to understand why that was, in actually developing a whole secondary career around what to do about that. And that actually, that secondary career, more than the primary career, was actually what got me into the role that I have as Director of Research and Chief Inclusion Accessibility Officer at CNIB. And so you know, then I had to recognize that in doing that, I was letting go of molecular biology and molecular genetics, but not really letting go of them, right? Because there were skills that one learns during one's PhD and one's postdocs that are ultimately translatable. And by this point, I knew I was very good at research strategy. I knew I was very good at identifying and defining research problems and figuring out how to move things along. And those are translatable skills, and it almost doesn't matter the discipline. And so as long as I could figure out the science, the doing of the science became less of a challenge. And so that kind of transferability, if you will, got me into the kind of spot that I'm in now, doing the fun and cool and exciting stuff that I do.
There, that's a great series of stories, and yeah, you make it sound so linear and that it was all easy, and it doesn't sound like it necessarily was, though.
People are not linear. Life is not linear,
yeah.
and
No,
regardless of how we
sure.
teach it, science is not linear.
For sure. And I can relate in the sense that, you know, I did a PhD in ocular pathology and ended up leaving that and getting into business, and now find myself back at something at the intersection of science and business. And I would not be able to do it without both those skill sets. And, you know, I thought when I was walking away from science as well, like, okay, well, I'm kind of saying goodbye to this. I just spent, 12 or 13 years of my life studying something that I'll never use again. But it teaches a certain way of viewing the world and thinking and problem solving that is certainly translatable in many cases.
But so I'm gonna push back on that a little bit,
sure.
Sean, and say that so one of the interesting things I did as a PhD student was I littered the University of Toronto with entities that were started on my watch, and activities that were started on my watch, and many of which are still ongoing today that I had helped found 20 some odd years ago. And one of them is an organization called the Life Sciences Career Development Organization, which runs an activity called the Life Sciences Career Development Series, which included a networking reception in those days. I think it still does. And the funny thing about this networking reception, the first time we did it, I sat at a table with a bunch of grad students, and there was this one fifth-year PhD from molecular genetics who said, you know, I'm almost done, but I actually don't know what I'm going to do next, because the only thing I learned during my PhD was how to hold a pipette. And I kind of thought to myself that if that's all you've learned 5 years into doing a PhD, either you have a micromanagerial supervisor or you haven't been paying attention. Because the thing is that you have to give oral presentations, you have to sometimes supervise summer students, you have to write a proposal, you have to write papers, you actually have to plan your experiments, you have to do stuff, you have to do a lot of critical thinking. And if you're not aware that you're doing that critical thinking, then what actually are you doing, right? Because all of those skills are translatable. The reason I actually wanted to say this is because you said something about walking away from science. And one thing you'll never hear me say is that I walked away from science, because I didn't, right? And I will push back vigorously and loudly on anyone who actually challenges me. Well, you're not in science, you're in the not-for-profit sector. What are you talking about science for? And I've also found members of the research community who are sort of like, well, you're not a researcher, you're not a faculty member. Because my assistant professorship at Queen's is adjunct, right? So I'm the equivalent of clinical faculty, and people will say, well, you're not a real faculty member. What do you know? Even if you have a PhD, and my response to that is, you want to look at my PubMed record, and do you want to take me on in terms of research strategy and science? Like, are we going to play that game? Because if we play the game, I'm happy to play it, but I'm also not likely to lose it. And that sounds horribly arrogant to say, but one of the greatest issues that I had as a geneticist, as a researcher, is that in that space, people, I don't think, could really entertain the concept of a blind faculty member. In disability studies, sure, and I don't mean to disparage disability studies. That's not the point. But at the end of the day, you know, being someone who can become a faculty member is about research strategy. It's about team management. It's about budget. It's about grantsmanship. It's about writing papers. It's about collaboration. It's actually not about doing the stuff at the bench, right? And the absolutely bizarre thing is, if you look at all of the ways that people get hired, you get hired on how many nature, salt, and science papers you have, which is basically what are you doing at the bench, and whether your boss can help you shape the paper into something that's a nature, cell science paper, and how big is your collaborative network, right? And I actually had an interview at a school in Western Canada that I will not name, where one of the members of the search committee, who I think, to be fair, had their own favorite candidate, and it happened to be their former PhD student, and so no nepotism whatsoever. That person said to me, you know, you're good, but you're not going to be good here. And I said, well, why do you think that? And they said, you know, we can see your potential, we can see how far you can go, but because you're not there yet, you're not going to be good faculty. And so
kind of an odd statement, isn't it?
Well, I mean, compare that to the other Western Canada school that Google stalked me from day one, and tried to get me to disclose my visual impairment. And I had one faculty member on that search committee say, you know, your postdoc publication in the Journal of Clinical Investigation had 38 authors on it. How much of that was your work, right? Meanwhile, of course, if you look any of the Cancer Genome Atlas stuff up, you're going to find hundreds, if not thousands, of authors on those publications, and nobody asks those people, right? So I mean, can you prove that that's ableism? No. Can you prove that that's because I was blind and other candidates were not? No. But I'm going to legitimately ask you, would you have asked that question of somebody else, right? So if you say to me, you walked away from science, I will actually say to you, absolutely not. I did not walk away from science, because everything that I learned in terms of research strategy, in terms of informatics, in terms of data analysis, in terms of the rigor of doing research, and the rigor of building a collaborative network, and how to win grants, and how to get money, and how to manage a team, I do all of that right now. It's just not what I was trained to do it in, not the technical training, but it's still medical research, and it's still high quality. And so I will cheerfully dare somebody to say otherwise.
Fair enough. I'll watch my words. No, when I'm saying I walk away from science, I've loved science my whole life as well. I've also I love science. I think my strength is more in business, and I've been able to kind of put those two together. Just a sidebar. You wouldn't know this either, but my sister is actually a visually impaired researcher at University of Ottawa, and having to navigate, you know, running a lab, trying to, apply for grants, win these grants and stuff, as someone who navigates around with a guide dog, but that's an aside. So your research focus now, like you are doing some pretty interesting research. I read through a poster that would have been ARVO, as an ARVO poster, I believe. So ARVO is, for those who are listening who don't know, normally called the Association for Research in Vision and Ophthalmology, or my former mentor would call it the Association for Recreation and Vacation in Ophthalmology, because the meetings used to always be held in Fort Lauderdale, Florida.
These days it's Baltimore or San Francisco.
Yeah, they rotate around. Yeah, so they used to always be in Fort Lauderdale, and I went about 6 or 7 times when they're in Fort Lauderdale. But went through that poster. Maybe you could just walk us through some of that latest research and the impetus to undertake.
Is that the COVID-19 poster?
Yeah, that was exactly talking about the how COVID-19
that was the one from
has
this.
affected
Yeah, that was
people.
the one from this
exactly.
year, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So my research team at CNIB has a broad focus of understanding quality of life and social determinants of health metrics for people who are blind or partially sighted, or deafblind. And so we expanded into dual sensory loss, and that if you're going to do that, that also means you're going to take a look at people who are deaf or hard of hearing, and so sensory disabilities broadly. And so So that means that we're very interested, of course, in access to health and social services. We're interested in employment and education outcomes. We're interested in accessing and using technology and how technology may influence social services, health services, education, and employment. And then when the pandemic hit, we got very interested in understanding how this massive discontinuity in our lives actually would impact the lived experience of people who are blind or partially sighted, because now we've got a pandemic that requires us to socially distance or physically distance. Guide dogs don't know what physical distancing means, so you know, if that's the case, then you wouldn't expect that, you know, that someone who's a guide dog user is going to be able to physically distance effectively. Many of the tactile markers on floors are many of the markers on floors, the physical distancing markers on floors, are not tactile. And so if you're a cane user, you have no idea where they are, right? And so the obvious question then is what's the impact of COVID-19 on all of this? And so the pillars of my research department are very much sort of education, employment, health and social services, and COVID-19, three basic pillars, right? And so the questions that we ask are all around, well, you know, what happens in each of these three environments for people who are blind or partially sighted. The other thing that I would say is because I run two departments at CNIB. I run the inclusion and accessibility, the IDEA team, the inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility team, and the research team. What we do, or what I strive for, and it's a piece of work. It's not intuitive for a lot of people to do this. What I strive to do is make sure that the research that we do impacts the inclusive workplace principles that my IDEA team is building, and that the whole notion of inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility is taken into consideration in the doing of research. That second one especially is a lot harder than you might think, because a lot of researchers will default to just thinking about research in isolation as a very reductionist sort of thing, and will not think about, particularly human participant related research, will not actually think about how to engage in inclusive ways. I've seen a few publications where people have actually written in their methods section, this survey was not provided to people who are blind or partially sighted because we don't know how to make the survey accessible, right? This is 2021, that's not an excuse, right?
Yeah,
and there's people who know how to do it. All you need to do is call them, right? Or look them up, and you can find me on the CNIB website, kind of thing, right? And so there's this sort of reductionist notion that's out there, and I actually saw this in a paper that had to do with a medical device approval, and you know, it was a medical device that could have been impacting the lives of people with disabilities, people with vision loss, and so nobody tested this medical device in a population of people with sensory impairments, because at the end of the day, they didn't know how to do it. And so they wrote the disclaimer that because we don't know how to do it, this is not intended for. And the fact that you don't know how to do something as a researcher, and that happens to be your exclusion criterion, that's shoddy research. I mean, come on, right? And so how you do inclusive research is something that that my team, and practically my team only, and I'm going to say something horribly arrogant here, but I genuinely mean it. My team and my team only, you know, will be able to do, because we have the IDEA principles living cheek by jowl, if you will, with the research methodology, and vice versa, right? And so that counts for something. And so the kind of work that we do ranges, I think, depends on the questions that we're asking. I would love longitudinal studies. I'd love to be able to sort of, you know, follow people through life courses and interventions, and understand what happens beginning, middle, and after. The problem is that those kinds of studies need lots and lots of resources, and frankly, we haven't been able to get that kind of money as yet. A lot of what we're doing instead is kind of the point in time cross-sectional study. So we've got a large funded project right now on understanding inclusive workplaces and what makes workplaces inclusive, which sounds very social sciencey, but there's a lot of sort of occupational health related in there. There's a lot of population data science related in there. There's a lot of sort of you know, thinking about how health policy and workplace policy interact in there. We've got other work that we've done, like I said, on the impact of COVID-19, and here, because of the pandemic, we have been able to try to do something a bit longitudinal, and try to understand kind of the impact of the pandemic at the beginning last year, April, March of this year, June, July of this year. We'll have another survey coming out in October, November of this year. And so we're able to do some time courses. We're able to do some, let's think about how this is going to work, and how we're able to do, how we're able to understand kind of what that lived experience is. And we ask the question always sort of from the place of, if we can understand the lived experience, can we then ultimately figure out ways to improve it, enhance it, modify it, you know, and so that's what the department does. It is applied translational. It is kind of person oriented, a different kind of clinical, but it's still important research, and it's very valuable work that frankly nobody else has done to this point.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I have a question. I might come back to it if we have time, but I wanted to ask you first about the initiative. One of many initiatives is the Building an Inclusive Life Sciences Future. I think this is an Ontario, Canada-based focus. I could be wrong, but I think it involves workshops. So maybe you can talk a little bit about, I guess, the impetus behind that and what the goals of that are.
I can't talk too much about it. That's a project that's under development, and something that I'm serving on the advisory committee for. It was a piece of work that Shift Health and Life Sciences Ontario have commissioned. Last year, Shift Health had approached me about sitting in on a panel that had to do with IDEA, inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility in the sciences. And I tend to get recommended for these things because of my expertise in accessibility of science education, and my accessibility, my background in accessibility of science and accessibility of healthcare. I get recommended for these things as, ironically enough, a scientist with a disability. And when I get recommended for these things, I usually will vet them and say yes. And so I did that this time. And we had this panel discussion in October of 2020. It was virtual during the pandemic. And it was a discussion on how important it was to pay attention to IDEA principles in science. But the thing with those kinds of conversations is, you have a 90-minute panel discussion. And at the end of 90 minutes, we all agree on something that we knew we were going to agree on before. But people are going to say, well, okay, you've talked about how it's important, and you've also talked about why it's important. Can you tell me how to do it? And I mean, the how to do it is the hard part, right? And there's no right answer. There's no wrong answer. There's answers that may or may not work over time, but we're so young in the space that we don't really know. The other thing that people will usually say is, how do we get people to buy into it? Because they don't understand the business case, right? And so the how to and the what's the business case for, you know, those tend to be longer conversations than a 90-minute panel. And thinking back on it, I think that's where the idea to do the Building an Inclusive Life Sciences Future in Ontario project came about. It came about because it needed to be, there needed to be something more than just, hey, let's have a panel. I've been on enough panels. I'm on panels every so often, right? I get invited to them, and lots of people have them, and they're great and they're wonderful. But you know, I'm here in a position where I want to make sure that the next generation of people who are doing science, who are coming in with a disability, or who acquire a disability in the doing of the science, and not just disability, but also, you know, members of our Indigenous communities and members of a variety of ethnic groups, and you know, people of color, and people who are Black, and people who are gender diverse, and people who are first-gen immigrants, and you know, everybody. We want to make sure that everyone's got the ability to participate and the ability to engage to the fullest extent. And you know, I'm gonna say this. I was an undergrad in 1994, 1995, and in 94, the absolute number of people with sight loss who went into a college or university education was nationally some number of thousands, and I don't remember off the top of my head exactly what it was. But here's the bizarre thing. In 2020, that absolute number did not increase, right? Over the course of 25 years, the absolute number of people who were blind or partially sighted who went into a post-secondary education had not changed. What did change was the numbers of people who were coming forward with learning disabilities and mental health disabilities and neurodiversity. And so the proportion of people who were blind or partially sighted in post-secondary education, which used to be relatively high, actually fell off. It's now less than 5%. And so what that tells me is that over 25 years, advances in technology, right? Over 25 years, including the invention of the smartphone and the tablet, pieces of technology that are supposed to impact how people who are blind or partially sighted actually interact with the world had nothing to do with the number of people making it into post-secondary education. So that means one of two things. It means either that the number of people who made it into post-secondary education was already capped out and could never increase. I don't believe that. That's not true, because I know of a lot of people who basically say, high school is hell, I'm done, right? Or what we've done in terms of technological advancement hasn't translated to the engagement of students with disabilities, because technology hasn't been the barrier, attitudes have been the barrier. And so if you take a data point like that, and then you say, well, all right, how are we going to improve the inclusion of life sciences and the ecosystem of life sciences in not just Ontario, but all of Canada? I think you have to start to say, this isn't an issue of there's people, why aren't we hiring them? The issue is there aren't people, but even when we're able to foster people within the system, we need to have an environment that is inclusive to them, so that we can then get them into a space they can be hired into inclusive environments. But we don't have those inclusive environments. We need to start having this conversation anyway. And that's at least part of what we hope to achieve.
That's interesting, talking about the just inclusive work environment in general. I touched on this in a previous episode with a guest named Laura Allen. She's the head of accessibility at Google in the US, and we dove into this topic a little bit in that episode. And she's definitely a champion for some of these same principles at Google. I guess that there's a lot. Google's only one place, though, right? There's a lot of places that need to start championing some of these perspectives and policies.
I want to say this. When we think about things like accessibility, often it becomes, let's make the building accessible, or let's make the information accessible. But it isn't about the structure. It's about the environment. It's about the attitudes. It's about the people, right? If you have a boss who says, I don't need to make this document accessible because Sean's never going to read it, right? Then your boss has got the wrong attitude.
Yeah, fair.
Because you don't know if Sean's ever going to read it or not. What happens if one of Sean's colleagues gives it to Sean? Right?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And so I mean, at the end of the day, everyone says the medium is the message. Thank you, Marshall McLuhan. And that's part of it, right? But it's also the how, not just the what, right? And honestly, the way you make math accessible isn't just by providing a Braille textbook of math. It's actually by teaching the concepts in ways that somebody can relate to, right? How are you going to teach probability using, well, actually, here's a really good example, right? You're going to teach probability, and often, if you think back to, well, in my day, they called it finite mathematics. Often when they did finite math, you taught probability by a roll of a dice, the roll of a die, or the roll of dice, plural, or you taught probability using a deck of playing cards, right? Somebody who's congenitally blind, right, who has never actually played with something other than a tactile playing card, and if they don't have access to a tactile playing card, then that's an even better example, right? How are they going to understand probability in the context of a deck of playing cards if they've never used a deck of playing cards, right? So you can write a textbook that's all about probability that talks about playing cards every 5 pages, right? And you can put that book in Braille, but that's meaningless if the person's never interacted with a deck of cards.
Fair, yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Here's another example. You want to go back to high school physics. How do people teach the Doppler effect, right? People teach the Doppler effect, which for the audience and those who have not encountered the term, the Doppler effect is the rising and lowering in pitch of a sound as it moves closer to and farther away from you, right? As an object comes towards you, the sound waves are compressed. As an object moves away from you, the sound waves are lengthened, and so the rising and lowering of the pitch happens. That's true for any kind of wave. It's true for sound. It's true for light. It's true for it's true for water waves. It's true for waves in all sorts of medium. And so the interesting thing is that when you learn the Doppler effect in high school, there's one way that you learn it for the most part. You learn it by going through an exercise where you watch a video of a train moving towards you and then away from you, or an ambulance moving towards you and then away from you with a siren on, right? Now, if A, you never grew up around a train, and I grew up on the island of Barbados, there's no train there, right? Or B, you're actually deaf, or congenitally, or like if you're deaf on one side, so you lose audio positioning, or you're deaf on both sides, so you can't hear anything, period, then those approaches aren't going to work to you. Right before the pandemic, I did something at a university in the GTA where I got together with a bunch of science faculty, and I actually gave this example. And I said, how would you actually teach the Doppler effect? And would you know, a room full of physics profs couldn't come up with an alternative answer?
But I would also believe that, because they probably haven't spent time really thinking about how do I teach it. They want to teach the majority, but not to everybody, right?
Well, no, it's also about teaching the way that you know how to teach. And at the end of the day, inclusive teaching and inclusive education is about putting yourself in the frame of reference of the other person. It's not about how you know how to do this. It's about thinking about how to do this if you sit in that other person's frame of reference. If somebody can't see the same way that you can, then can you explain things so that they're able to understand them tactilely or audio or whatever, right? And if somebody can't hear, can you explain things differently? For the Doppler effect thing, nobody thought of the slinky, right? And yet a slinky, you can use it to create waves. You can stretch it out, you can push it together, and a slinky would be a very good tactile demonstration of the Doppler effect. Nobody thought about it until I mentioned it.
No, it makes a lot of sense.
So it's not just the, I'm going to make this an accessible format. It's about thinking about the concepts and how you're teaching them.
Yeah, but that makes a lot of sense. But listen, I mean, I've taken a lot of your time today. We should definitely do a round two, because we got through about half of the questions I think that we wanted to cover. But if you'd be open to it, maybe
I'm totally open to scheduling a round two.
Excellent. Listen, Dr. Sukhai, it's really been a pleasure. You've given me some food for thought as well. So I'm gonna take some of these thoughts away, and hopefully the audience has learned something from this as well. And we look forward to having you back for round two to dive into some more topics.
Absolutely. I look forward to it, Sean.
All right. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
And that concludes today's episode of the Broad Eye Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Of course, ratings and reviews are always welcome. And you can certainly share this episode with any of your colleagues or friends who might enjoy it. Thanks for listening.